So let's add this little podcast from People of the Earth, the book that we used before, and look at human origins, and then we'll come back and look at archaic humans in a minute in the next chapter. So this is the artist's impression of male and female Australopithecus afarensis walking on soft ash at Laetoli, Tanzania, about 3.6 million years ago, and literally such imprints left behind in volcanic ashes and other forms of geologic formations have been used to glean evidence of different morphologies. So you can see this is a bipedal footstep here. So bipedalism is already around by the time we came out of the Pliocene and East African erdification happened. You can see a bit of the vegetation type here implied in the artist's impression. So the major sites that are used in this chapter, going back to about 7 million years, are so culture and sites here. So this is something that we will visit a little bit later, and no technology at this point at 4 million years ago, for example. Toromenalia, Aramis, Hadar, Laetoli that we just mentioned, and at the same time we have Kanapoli, Alia, Middle Awash, which comes up a lot in stone tools, coming more to more recent times in the Pleistocene, East Turkana, Malapa, Gona, and Olduvai Gorge. Olduvai tools, you remember some of the older tools that correspond to various skill levels, and we'll discuss details on the social networks that may have been existent at the time in, let's say, parts of Africa where technology transfer may have happened. And the Oldowan culture is mentioned here with some unknown time of origin and unknown time of extinction, for example, with some known time period over which some archaeological evidences exist. Associated with them, of course, are always climate change epochs, so geological epochs going a little bit further back into the Cenozoic era, coming out of the meteorite strike, end of the dinosaurs, and movement of India is beginning to happen towards the northern hemisphere from across the equator to the south. So you have the Paleocene coming into the Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, and then we have the Pliocene, Pleistocene boundary, which we use often for East African erdification story, coming into the Holocene. So here you have, in terms of developments, expansion of mammals, which in some ways started after the extinction of the dinosaurs. During this time also you have many new mammal species appearing. Monsoon would have been established by this time. India is in place, Himalayas are in place, monsoonal circulation is set up. The Myosin mountain of the so-called Myosin Crisis corresponds to the potential perturbation to the link between Mediterranean Ocean and the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar, and the mountain of salt that is left behind around 6 million years ago. But there are many other interesting things that happened in the Miocene. Hominoid radiation and human evolution, which we will look at from both the books, this one and the main book we are using, Climate and Human Evolution. So you can see that there is a low frequency warm period and cool period here, varying at some time scale that is obviously related mostly to the Milankovitch cycles, and we will talk about how time scales changed along the way, especially when we come closer here into Pliocene, Pleistocene boundaries, where we go from the obliquity cycle, precession cycle, into obliquity cycle, into the ellipticity cycle, so 100,000 year ice ages here. So you can see multiple higher frequency cooling and warming episodes here in the Pleistocene. We will learn quite a bit about those before we zoom into the climate of the last 135,000 years. And the geologic geological events associated with those. To go with the previous chart is to look at temperature again, but now zooming into 3.3 million years. So uncertain climatic details here with more evidence of climatic change over here, again with warmer and colder periods. And we will look at this period much more because here is where we had very few Homo lineages left. Basically Neanderthals, Sapiens, and maybe Floresiensis, Devonians, and so on. We'll come back to that later on. So Pleistocene starts here, and this is where the 100,000 year ice age cycles are much more dominant, and we get into the Holocene after the end of the last of the ice ages here. But looking at the hominin types, we start with the Australopithecus, maybe 4.2 million years ago to maybe 1.5, some uncertainty there. Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, Homo erectus coming to 30,000 years ago maybe, so that is one of the species that would have been around here as well. And Homo heidelbergensis is kind of at the origin of multiple species afterwards, so 600,000 to 200,000 years ago, somewhere in this range here. So we have Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens, and there are other species added here later on with Devonians and Floresiensis and so on. So we are basically around for about the last 3,000 years ago or so to present. So we will end up introducing terminologies like anatomically modern human in terms of the skeletal structures, jaws, cranium, and of course bipedalism. Then we'll also begin to talk about modern behavior, so anatomically modern or modern human in terms of behavior. So we start with the technology of stone tool making here, and there are some debates about whether we are unique in this. It turns out our relatives like chimpanzees and gorillas and even some other animals may be able to make tools. Fire got mastered at some point, which affected our evolution quite seriously as well. Art in Europe appears much more recently, bows and arrows, writing and metal. So we start the historic period here, and we can consider this as the prehistoric period. And just in terms of ecology, so these are technologies just in terms of economy, scavenging and gathering, and hunting and gathering, and then food production started. The main question there is whether agriculture was attempted before the Holocene during the hiccup out of the last glacial maximum, when we will look at some recooling like the Younger Dryas, and whether climate was too harsh for agriculture to take hold, and whether Holocene climate stability made it possible to for agriculture to become much more stable way of living, or whether the end of hunting gathering happened because of the lack of food or resources in terms of us having hunted down all the animals we can eat, or also whether the Holocene is stable because we became agriculturalists and we began to already have an impact on climate in terms of deforestation and so on. But definitely origins of state and the civilizations, something we will look at. So this is just another way of looking at this history now. Bipedalism and four-footed quadrupedalism. Two major theories account for the evolution of bipedalism. If the last common ancestor of chimpanzees, gorillas, and humans was not a knuckle walker, quadrupedal, the body's center of gravity lies in the middle of the area bounded by legs and arms, then knuckle walking would have evolved independently in both chimpanzees and gorillas. Under this theory, the ancestral locomotion for humans was not knuckle walking, so maybe it's independent of going from quadrupedal to bipedal. The other one, if the last common ancestor for chimpanzees, gorillas, and humans was a knuckle walker, then ancestral condition for human is knuckle walking. Humans are bipedal, where the body's center of gravity is displaced much less, and thus walking is much more efficient. So we will come back to this later on again. So here is a knuckle walking ancestor, gorillas, chimpanzees leading to human bipedalism, but in this one non-knuckle walking ancestor here. So knuckle walking evolves independently, and then another branch goes into chimpanzees and knuckle walking to bipedalism. So our common ancestor is not necessarily related to this. We will see that later on. So here is a much simplified version of how old world monkeys, apes and humans evolved. We will see this later on in the other book as well. So now we are going back 50 million years ago, Eocene, Oligocene, Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene that we've talked about. So we are splitting off here the old world monkeys around 23.5 million years ago, and many apes here on a different branch, chimpanzees and eventually humans. So here we are splitting off around 3 to 5 million years ago. Okay, so the main hypothesis is, of course, that bipedalism evolved out of climate change and acidification of East Africa, as we will discuss in a bit more detail later on. So human development to 5,000 years before present looks at various features like the brain size, teeth, limbs, species and sites and dates. So we are looking here at 3.9 million years ago to 4.5 million years ago in East Africa, which includes Aramis and Alea group, and Hayder and Laetoli group. Laetoli group goes to 3 to 4 million years. Gracile group goes, gracile is about use of hands and so on for various functions. Here South Africa, no reliable dates. East Africa 1.5 to 3.5 million years ago. The robust group goes again, no reliable dates in South Africa, but East Africa goes from 2.7 million years ago to 1 million. I've been reading it in reverse here, sorry about that. And similarly early Homo group, which is our main interest, by 2.4 million years ago they are already present, going to 1.6 million years ago. These dates keep getting revised as more evidences are found. So you can see brain size increase clearly, teeth changes, so small back teeth, large front teeth, reduced canines, to our early homos having variable, generally smaller than those of robust and gracile forms. Limbs bipedal, long arms, here bipedal but lower limbs, still partially adapted to arboreal life, so relying a lot on being in trees, either to find food or to avoid predation and so on, or avoid predators. Species and sites goes from Ardipithecus ramidus, so East Africa, Middle Awash and Gonar and Ethiopia, to here East Africa, so Olduvai, East Turkana and Stercofontein in Fontaine, however it's pronounced, in South Africa. Okay, so these are just some early stone technologies. Principles of fracturing stone were fully understood by early stone workers who used them to make simple but very effective artifacts. Certain types of flinty rock will fracture in a distinctive way, as illustrated here. Okay. Early stone workers used a heavy hammerstone to remove edge flakes, or they struck lumps of rock against anvils to produce the stem. So you can see different here than here, but you can see opposable thumbs here already. Older one tools were frequently made by removing a few flakes from lava lumps to form jagged working edges. Such flakes have been shown by experiment to be remarkably effective in dismembering or butchering game animals. Perhaps it is a small wonder that this simple stone technology was so long lasting. When bow is stuck or on a flinty rock, a cone percussion is formed by shock waves rippling through the stone. A flake is formed, and when the block or core is hit at the edge and the stone fractures along the edge of the ripple, using a hammerstone and an anvil. So these are empirically developed knowledge probably, but finally this is a provisional interpretation of evolutionary relationship between known hominin forms after 6 million years ago. So many uncertainties there. So Sahelanthropus tacadensis, Ororin tugenensis. I'm not a biologist, you can obviously see that. Ardipithecus carabba, Ardipithecus ramidus, going here into Australopithecus afarensis, maybe also going into robust Australopithecines, but going here into Australopithecus garhi and africanus, evolving into Homo habilis and ergaster, but Homo heidelbergensis then leads to Homo erectus, sapiens, and Neanderthalensis. Obviously, all these coexisting ones, everybody disappeared, and by the end of the last glacial maximum, by far we know that only sapiens and maybe Floresiensis survived. Okay. To summarize this chapter, the story of human evolution begins with the separation of chimpanzee and human lines from a common and as yet unknown ancestor about 7 million years ago. The first hominins were tree-living with long arms and legs and broad chests, who eventually became bipedal, walking on 2 limbs. They adapted to more open country in Africa, which resulted from a global cooling over 4 million years ago, by broadening their diet to include more meat and by achieving great mobility and behavioral flexibility. So this story about what leads to bipedalism is often related to climate-driven vegetation changes over East Africa, which we will look at later on again. The earliest known possible hominin is Sahelanthropus tacadensis from Chad, which may date between 7 and 6 million years ago. A small bipedal hominin named Ardipithecus ramidus flourished in Ethiopia around 4.5 to 4.3 million years ago. Earliest known Australopithecine, or southern ape person, is Australopithecus anamensis, dated to 4.2 to 3.9 million years ago. It was followed by various Australopithecines, including the relatively well-known afarensis, Australopithecus afarensis, who flourished 3.7 to 3 million years ago. So in the next chapter of this book, we will come closer to timelines and look at archaic humans as well. So I'll keep adding this with the other book where appropriate, so you can digress and look into these podcasts if you have more interest in these topics. Okay.